Under the bright midday sun of Kansas City, Missouri, warm golden rays slipped through the windows of Heartland Grill and Diner, spilling across a room filled with the scent of hot food and the lively hum of conversation. Amid what seemed like an ordinary, peaceful afternoon, David Brooks, a middle-aged man, sat beside his young daughter, only to witness a scene that tightened his chest. An elderly couple being sharply scolded by a stern manager for dropping their wallet, facing the humiliating prospect of being kicked out of the restaurant. Shame written plainly across their faces. David was a single father. In his pocket, he had only $15 left, the last bit he'd saved for the following week's rent. Yet without hesitation, he quietly stood up, walked to the counter, and paid the couple's entire bill, rescuing them from the painful moment without expecting even a word of thanks. As he left the diner and retraced his steps, David unexpectedly spotted the missing wallet. He returned it right away, only to freeze when he discovered the truth. The elderly couple was not poor at all. They were generous millionaires. David couldn't have imagined that his small act of kindness would become an invisible thread binding their fate to his, setting off a chain of events that would change his life forever. Before this story goes any further, if you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss these everyday stories that touch the heart. Now, ask yourself this: what happens when kindness is repaid in a way no one ever expects? The alarm rang at 5 in the morning. David Brooks opened his eyes in the darkness of the small bedroom, his eyelids heavy after a night of barely 3 hours of sleep following his night shift. He was 37, but his face looked much older. Deep lines etched into the corners of his eyes, calloused hands worn down by years of hard labor. He lay still for a moment, staring up at the ceiling with its spiderweb of jagged cracks. The room was freezing cold. The heating system had broken 2 months ago, and he didn't have the money to fix it. His breath came out in faint white puffs in the icy air. With a heavy sigh, David pushed the blanket aside and sat up. The floor felt like ice under his bare feet. He pulled on an old hoodie, torn at the elbows but still warm enough, then quietly stepped out of the room. Amber was sleeping on the sofa in the living room, curled up under 2 thin blankets. Her blonde hair was a tangled mess on the pillow, one arm wrapped tightly around a small teddy bear, the last gift her mother had given her before she died. David stopped in the dark, just looking at her. She seemed so small it hurt to look at her. 7 years old. She should have had a peaceful childhood, free from money worries, not sleeping on a sofa because her bed had been sold. He bent down and gently tugged the blanket a little higher to keep her warm. Amber shifted slightly, mumbling a few unintelligible words in her sleep. David leaned in and kissed her forehead. "Daddy loves you," he whispered. "Daddy is going to make things better. Daddy promises." But the moment the promise left his lips, a question echoed deep in his mind. Would he really be able to keep it? In the kitchen, David opened the fridge. The dim yellow light flicked on, revealing nearly empty shelves. A carton of milk, only about a quarter left. Half a loaf of bread, already a bit dry and hard. A jar of peanut butter scraped nearly to the bottom. A wrinkled apple. An old bottle of mustard. That was it. He closed the fridge, leaving his hand on the door, head hanging low. What am I even using to raise my child? He opened the kitchen cabinet. Some packets of instant noodles, a can of beans that had expired over a month ago, half a bag of oatmeal. That was everything they had left. David took the milk carton and carefully poured it into a small cup, trying to save the larger portion for Amber. As for him, he would just drink coffee. Black coffee, no sugar, no milk, the cheapest kind from the discount supermarket, as bitter as his life felt right now. He switched on the electric kettle. The old thing whined like it was about to give out. The bitter smell of coffee slowly spread through the air, mixing with the damp, moldy scent seeping from the water-stained corners of the walls. David sat down at the kitchen table, an old wooden one, its surface scarred with scratches and dark burn marks from hot pans. He cupped his hands around the mug of coffee, letting the heat seep slowly into his frozen fingers. On the counter, right next to a glass jar, sat a stack of papers. David didn't want to look at them, but his eyes slid over each bold line anyway. Electric bill, $127. Past due 30 days. Water bill, $43. Past due. 15 days medical debt, $4,187. Collection. Stage 3, final notice. Rent, $200. Due March 15th. Today was only the 8th. 7 days left. David brought both hands up to cover his face. The numbers swirled in his head like a tornado with no way out. 127. 43. 4,287. 200. How could he possibly pay? How? He reached for the glass jar, the place where every bit he earned he shoved in there, taking out neighbors' trash, fixing computers for acquaintances, working the night shift as a security guard at a nearby office building. He poured everything out onto the table and began to count. $12. 13. 14. 15. Exactly $15. He sat there, staring at the crumpled bills and dull, worn coins. This was everything. The last thin line between his family and being thrown out of this apartment. The rent was $200. He was short $185. There was no way. David leaned his elbows on the table, bowed his head, and let himself sink into the feeling of utter despair. The first tears fell onto the wooden surface, spreading into dark little circles. Patricia, honey, I don't know what to do anymore. He looked up at the wedding photo on the wall. Patricia, in a simple white dress, radiantly beautiful, her blue eyes shining with happiness. Next to her stood the David from back then. Thick, dark hair, not a wrinkle in sight, eyes full of hope. 10 years. Just 10 years. And it felt like an entire lifetime. He remembered that day perfectly. The small backyard wedding at Patricia's parents' house. No fancy reception, no big guest list, just family, a few close friends, and a whole lot of love. I promise I'll always take care of you, David had whispered as they danced their first dance. Don't make promises you can't keep, Patricia had laughed. I just need you to stay with me. That's enough. And yet in the end, he hadn't stayed with her all the way to the end. Not in those final months. Not when she needed him most. The memories from 3 years ago flooded back like a tidal wave. The hospital room was cold, saturated with the smell of disinfectant. The steady beeping of the heart monitor filled the silence. Harsh fluorescent light washed everything in a lifeless gray. Patricia lay in the bed, so thin it looked like she was nothing but skin stretched over bone. Cancer had ravaged her body mercilessly, but her blue eyes, though dimmer, still looked at David with boundless love. "Promise me," she whispered, her voice as faint as a passing breeze. "Promise me you'll teach our daughter to be a good person." David gripped her small, icy hand tightly. "Don't say that. You're going to get better." "David." This time, though weak, her voice was firm. "You know. We both know." Tears fell from David's eyes, darkening the bedsheet. Don't leave me. You have to be strong for Amber. She needs you more than anything." Patricia tried to smile. "Don't let her grow up thinking money is everything. Don't let her believe that being rich or poor determines a person's worth." "What do you want me to teach her?" David asked, his voice breaking. "Teach her how to love. Teach her to help others, even when she doesn't have much herself. Teach her that a kind heart is worth more than a full wallet." Patricia summoned the strength to squeeze his hand one last time. "Promise me, David." David nodded, tears running freely now. "I promise, sweetheart. I promise." 2 days later, Patricia was gone. David had held Amber, just 4 years old then, in his arms. trying to explain something he himself still couldn't accept. "Where did Mommy go, Daddy?" "Mommy went to a better place, baby. A place where she doesn't hurt anymore." "When is Mommy coming back?" David hugged her tighter, letting his tears soak into her blonde hair. "Mommy can't come back, sweetheart, but she'll always be in our hearts. Back to the present, with all its piling hardships." David wiped his tears and looked again at the photo on the wall. "I'm trying my best, honey, but sometimes I feel like such a failure. I can't give our daughter a good life. I can't even feed her properly." He glanced at the clock. 6:15. Time to start getting Amber ready. David stood up, took the old frying pan, and turned on the gas stove. The tiny blue flame flickered. He took 2 slices of bread, one for Amber, one for himself, and spread peanut butter over them. No jam, no real butter, just peanut butter. He set Amber's slice on a plate along with the cup of milk. His own slice? He put it aside. He would drink coffee. She needed the food more than he did. She was still growing. At 6:30, Amber woke up. She rubbed her eyes in the dim morning light, then saw David in the kitchen. A bright smile instantly spread across her small face. "Morning, Daddy." Her voice was clear and carefree, so innocent that David's heart softened and ached at the same time. "Morning, Princess," he smiled, trying to hide his exhaustion. "Breakfast is ready." Amber climbed onto the chair and looked at the thin sandwich. "Peanut butter." "Yeah, your favorite peanut butter." Amber stared at the sandwich for a moment. She wasn't clueless. Even at 7, she understood how little they had. She knew her dad was trying. "I like peanut butter, Daddy," she said, forcing her voice to sound cheerful. David swallowed hard and turned his back so she wouldn't see the redness in his eyes. "Good. Eat up, baby. Then we'll head to school." While Amber ate, David packed her backpack. Old textbooks, some with spines taped together more than once. A small pencil case with stubby, worn-down pencils. No lunchbox, thankfully. The school had a free lunch program. "Daddy's not eating?" Amber asked, seeing him only drink coffee. "I already ate while you were still asleep," David lied, his voice disturbingly calm from having said that too many times. Amber nodded, but her eyes lingered on the single sandwich on the table. At 7, they left the apartment. Outside, the March air in Kansas City sliced like a knife. David pulled Amber's hoodie up over her head and carefully adjusted her scarf. They walked to the bus stop, 3 miles. David didn't have enough money for 2 bus fares. He could only afford one for Amber to get to school. On the way, they passed a bakery that had just opened. The smell of freshly baked bread drifted all the way to the sidewalk. Amber halted for a second, eyes fixed on the display window. Golden croissants, cakes covered in white frosting. "Daddy," she breathed. "What do you want, baby?" David asked, even though he already knew he couldn't buy her anything. Amber shook her head and squeezed his hand tighter. "Nothing. I just like looking at them." The pain in David's chest twisted, like someone was driving a knife into it. A 7-year-old child should only be thinking about games, comic books, dolls, not learning how to be silent, how not to ask, how to accept going without. "One day," David whispered, kneeling down to her eye level, "one day, Daddy will buy you any pastry you want. I promise." Amber threw her arms around his neck. "I don't need pastries, Daddy. I just need you." David held her tightly, making sure she couldn't see the tears threatening to spill again. At the bus stop, he waited with Amber until the bus arrived. He kissed her forehead. "Daddy loves you. Be good at school, okay?" "I love you too, Daddy. Are you going to work?" "Yeah, Daddy's going to look for a job." The bus pulled away, Amber pressing her face against the window, waving. David waved back until the bus disappeared from sight. Then he turned and began the long 3-mile walk back home, in the biting cold, with an empty stomach and aching legs. But he had no other choice. Passing by a church, he saw a sign. Free meals, Tuesday and Thursday, 5 p.m. Today was Saturday. 3 more days to go. David lowered his head and kept walking. Back at the apartment, he sat down in front of his old laptop, the screen cracked in one corner, the E key missing, forcing him to copy and paste the letter from elsewhere every time he needed it. He opened job sites and resumed sending out applications identical to the hundreds he had already submitted. Warehouse worker, $12 an hour. Requirement, 2 years experience. David applied. Delivery driver, $11 an hour. Requirement, clean driver's license, own vehicle. David didn't have a car. Skip. Custodial staff, $10 an hour, night shift. David applied. By 10 in the morning, he had sent out 20 job applications. Still no replies. The phone rang. David looked at the screen. An unknown number. His heart skipped. Could this be a chance? Hello? Mr. Brooks? This is the office of Dr. Harrison. We're calling about your medical debt related to your wife's treatment. You currently owe $4,287 and— I know, David cut in, his voice drained. I know I'm in debt, but I don't have any money. Mr. Brooks, if you can't arrange a payment plan, we'll have to move your case to court. Go ahead, David said, his voice hollow. I've got nothing left to lose. He hung up, and then, for the first time after months of trying to hold it together, David Brooks, the man who kept telling his daughter everything would be okay, completely broke down. He braced his elbows on the table, buried his face in his hands, and sobbed. Sobbed out of helplessness. Sobbed from the crushing sense of failure. Sobbed because his little girl would have to grow up in a life where he couldn't give her what she deserved. The phone rang again. David didn't want to pick up, but the ringing went on and on, relentless. Finally, he reached for it. What? Mr. Brooks? This is Pinnacle Industries' office. We received your job application last month for the warehouse position. Could you come in for an interview? David's heart thundered. Yes, I can. When? Today at 2 p.m. Does that work for you? Yes, I'll be there. Hanging up, David checked the time. 10:30. He had 3.5 hours to get ready. He went into the bedroom and took out the only suit he had left, the one he'd worn at his wedding 10 years ago. The fabric was faded, a bit tight around the shoulders, with worn spots at the elbows. But it was all he had. He plugged in the old iron and pressed out every wrinkle. He polished his worn leather shoes, trying to coax a bit more shine out of them. Then he showered in cold water. The hot water had been cut off the week before because of unpaid bills. At 1 o'clock, David set out. No money for bus fare. He had to walk. 5 miles to the Pinnacle Industries building. He walked in the old suit, under the gentle March afternoon sun. Sweat began to bead beneath his shirt, but he didn't stop. He arrived at 1:55. The high-rise tower gleamed with reflective glass, his own figure a small shadow among the countless panels. Stepping into the lobby, he suddenly felt completely out of place in the sleek, polished space. The blonde receptionist, with her hair neatly pinned up, looked up and ran her eyes over him from head to toe. Her gaze lingered for a second on the old suit, the worn shoes, the sweat still on his face. "How can I help you, sir?" "I have a 2 o'clock interview. David Brooks." She tapped on the keyboard a few times. "Yes, that's right. Please have a seat and wait." David sat down on the plush leather chair, feeling more and more like he didn't belong there. The people in the lobby, everyone was neat, relaxed, carrying briefcases or the latest phones. Now and then, someone glanced over at him with an unreadable expression. He waited 30 minutes. Then another hour. Finally, a middle-aged woman stepped out, her name badge reading Linda Chen. "Mr. Brooks?" "Yes, that's me. Please come with me." They went into a small room. Miss Linda sat down across from him and opened his file. "So, Mr. Brooks, I see here you used to work as an assembly line worker?" "Yes, At Midland Manufacturing, but the plant shut down 10 months ago. And you've been unemployed for 10 months since then? Yes, I've been sending applications everywhere, taking odd jobs, but 10 months is quite a long gap, Mr. Brooks. I know, David said, fighting to keep his voice steady, but I'm willing to work very hard. I really need this job. I have a daughter. Mr. Brooks, she cut in, her tone slightly stiff. We're looking for someone with more recent work experience. To be completely honest, with a 10-month gap in your employment history, I don't think you're the right fit. David's heart seemed to drop. Please, just give me a chance. I'll work harder than anyone. I can— Thank you for coming in, Mr. Brooks, she said, closing the file. We'll be in touch if anything changes. But David knew exactly what that meant. He walked out of the building and stood on the sidewalk, watching the bustling crowd. Everyone had somewhere to be. A job, a purpose. And him? What was he in this big city? David turned away and started the 5-mile walk back home. Under the afternoon sun, in a suit soaked with sweat, with a heart that felt completely hollow. At 4 in the afternoon, he reached the apartment. He took off the suit and carefully hung it up, just in case there would be another interview someday. If there ever was. He sat down, opened the laptop again, and kept sending out more hopeless applications. At 5, he went to pick Amber up from school. She ran toward him, her face glowing. Daddy! David opened his arms and scooped her up. How was school today, baby? It was great. Today my teacher said next week is my birthday. Amber grabbed his sleeve, her eyes sparkling. Daddy, can I have a birthday party, like the other kids in class? David's heart stalled. A birthday party. Amber's classmates talked about parties with big cakes, balloons, presents. Last year, he'd only had enough money to buy her a single small cupcake from the supermarket and give her the tightest hug he could. And this year, we'll figure something out, baby, David said, trying to keep his tone light. Daddy will do his best. I don't need a big party, Daddy, Amber said, her eyes full of simple hope. I just want to go eat out with you. Like when I used to go with you and Mommy. Tears stung his eyes. David knelt down and pulled her into a tight hug. Okay, princess. This Saturday, Daddy will take you out to eat. I promise. Amber bounced with joy. On the walk home, David did the math in his head. $15? The rent? The electric bill? The water bill? The hospital debt? But this was his daughter's birthday. Maybe he could ask the landlord for a few extra days. Maybe next week he'd finally find a job. Maybe there would be some small miracle. But deep down, David knew he had stopped believing in miracles a long time ago. All he had left was a promise to his little girl, and a weary heart that still forced itself to keep going. On Saturday afternoon, David and Amber walked into Heartland Grill and Diner, a modest, family-style restaurant in downtown Kansas City. The cozy space was filled with the smell of grilled meat, vegetables sautéed in butter, and freshly baked bread. Plates clinked softly against polished wooden tables, cutlery tapped on white porcelain, and lively conversations wove through the room bathed in warm golden light. David chose a table near the entrance. His hand trembled slightly as he held the laminated menu. Amber sat across from him, her blue eyes lighting up every time a tray of food passed by. Golden fried chicken, mashed potatoes covered in rich brown gravy, warm rolls still steaming. Daddy, can I order this one? Amber pointed at the picture of a fried chicken dish with French fries. $12.99. David swallowed, his eyes stopping at the number. He had exactly $15 left in his pocket. $15, the money he had planned to keep for next week's rent. But today was his daughter's birthday. It was the promise he had already spoken out loud. Baby, let Daddy look at the menu a little more, okay? He said, trying to keep his voice steady. Amber obediently nodded, still smiling brightly. completely unaware of the sharp ache spreading through the chest of the father sitting across from her. David glanced around the restaurant. At the table next to them, a well-dressed white couple was laughing comfortably. The diamond ring on the woman's hand sparkled every time she moved. They casually counted out cash to pay their bill as if it were nothing more than a few scraps of paper. David looked down at his own calloused hands, thickened skin etched deep from years of hard labor. He let out a quiet sigh and set the menu down. "Amber, baby, I think we should—" A sudden shout cut through the air, harsh and sharp. "If you don't have money, then don't eat here!" The angry, impatient voice sliced through the cozy atmosphere like a knife. David jolted and turned around. At the back of the restaurant, one table had fallen silent. Megan Clark, a young waitress, stood nearby, holding her order pad tightly against her chest, looking torn between stepping forward and backing away. Facing her was Frank Dalton, the owner of the restaurant, an overweight man with a face deeply lined from constant frowning, leaning forward, his booming voice rising over the background noise as he unloaded on an elderly couple. The older couple looked desperately flustered. Elaine Prescott, a silver-haired woman with her hair tied back neatly, was fumbling with her scarf, while Arthur Prescott, a tall but now stooped man, hunched over, rummaging through his jacket pockets with trembling hands. David's stomach twisted. Frank let out a short, cold laugh, a sound completely devoid of warmth. "Let me guess," he sneered. "You thought you could just sit down, order yourselves a nice meal, and then act all innocent, like nobody would notice you can't pay the bill, right?" He paused, his tone dripping with mockery. "This is a restaurant, not a charity." Elaine's voice shook. "Sir, we do have money. We must have dropped our wallet somewhere. Please, if you just let us step outside to look for it, we promise—" "Promise." Frank cut her off, his voice as sharp as a blade. "Yeah, I've heard that one before. It's always, 'Oh, I must have misplaced my wallet.' And then, next thing you know, it's, 'Oh, let me work it off in the kitchen,' like some Hollywood movie." His lip curled. Old folks always seem to have the most tragic little stories to tell. A few customers had started to turn and stare, clearly uncomfortable, but no one said a word. A man in a suit shook his head, muttering something too quietly for anyone to catch. A woman dabbed at her mouth with a napkin, then deliberately turned her face away. David's fingernails dug into the wooden table. Arthur was still shakily patting down his pockets, his voice confused and panicked. "It must have fallen out when we got out of the taxi, Elaine." Frank let out another dry, contemptuous laugh. "Oh, a taxi, huh? So you had money when you got here, but when it's time to pay, it just magically disappears? How convenient." Elaine's voice was on the verge of breaking. "Please, just give us a little more time. We'll find it." Frank leaned down closer, his shadow swallowing them up. "Everybody hear that?" he called out, turning toward the nearby tables, his voice loud enough for the whole place. "They just need a little more time. Maybe we should all chip in and sponsor them, huh?" Then he lowered his voice, quieter, but still sharp enough for the nearby tables to hear every barb. "You think just because you're old, I won't kick you out? Go ahead and see if I will." David shot up from his seat. The scrape of the chair across the floor rang out clearly in the room, now stretched tight like a taut wire, ripping through the silence like a blade. Dozens of eyes swung toward him. It felt like the whole restaurant was staring, but David no longer cared. His heart was pounding, both hands clenched into fists. He didn't think, he didn't weigh the consequences. His legs were already moving, carrying him toward Frank, until he was standing between the restaurant owner and the elderly couple. "That's enough," David said, his voice low but firm, even as the fire in his chest burned hot. Frank's eyebrows twitched. He straightened up, folding his arms across his chest, and gave David a slow once-over. "Oh, great. Now we've got ourselves a hero." David didn't back down. "You don't have to talk to them like that." Frank's lips curled into a smirk, stretching each word. "And what exactly are you going to do about it, pal? Give me a lecture on manners?" "You know very well they're not trying to scam you," David replied, still forcing himself to stay calm. Frank's eyes darkened. There was a flicker of something cruel behind them. "You don't know that?" "Yes, I do." The smile on Frank's face grew colder. He stepped back half a pace, his voice dropping but still crisp and clear. "Oh, I get it now." He nodded slowly, glancing at Elaine and Arthur before turning back to David. "You feel sorry for them, don't you?" David swallowed, but he didn't look away. Frank stepped in again, his tone like a needle. "Tell me something, pal. Are you going to pay for their meal? Because if you're not, I suggest you go back to your table and let the adults handle this." The air between them thickened, heavy and suffocating. From the table in the distance, Amber clutched the edge of her chair, eyes wide as she watched her father, fear and confusion swirling together in her small gaze. David drew in a deep breath. He slipped his hand into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled bill. $15. Every last bit he had scraped together over months. Next week's rent. Everything he had left. All of it. He slapped the bill down on the counter. "Now you don't have any reason to humiliate them." For the first time, Frank hesitated. He looked at the money, then at David. For a fleeting moment, something like surprise, maybe even the faintest flicker of respect, crossed his face. But it vanished quickly. With an exaggerated sigh, Frank snatched up the bill and shoved it into the register. "Suit yourself," he muttered. "But don't come crying to me if they played you." David didn't bother responding. He turned to Elaine and Arthur. Their eyes were wide, their expressions a mixture of shock, emotion, and disbelief. Elaine raised a hand, her fingers trembling. You didn't have to do that." Arthur forced the words out, his voice strained. "We could have managed somehow." David just gave a faint, tired but genuine smile. "Everyone needs help sometimes. Don't worry about it." Elaine blinked rapidly to keep the tears from spilling over. She hurriedly grabbed a napkin and, with shaking hands, scribbled a few lines on it. "This is our phone number. Please, if you ever need anything at all, call us." David took it and nodded. They left the restaurant quietly, their small figures swallowed up between the rows of tables. Life at Heartland Grill slowly returned to normal. The clinking of cutlery, the chatter, the servers calling out orders. People pretended as if nothing had happened. Only David remained standing there for a few extra seconds, staring at the napkin in his hand. The weight of what he had just done dropped onto his chest like a boulder. $15. Gone. He walked back to the table. Amber was looking at him with red-rimmed eyes, whispering, "Daddy, I'm sorry." David sat down and pulled her into his arms. "No, baby. Don't ever apologize for me doing the right thing." Amber's arms tightened around his neck, but as his daughter buried her face in his shoulder, David closed his eyes. He fought to swallow the lump rising in his throat. What had he just done? David dropped back into his seat, his hands clasped tightly together on the wooden tabletop, his jaw clenched so hard it hurt. The ka-ching of the cash register rang out from the counter, stamping finality onto the money he had just handed over. His last savings. Next week's rent. Everything he had scraped together over months. Gone in a matter of seconds. His stomach twisted, not just from hunger, but from the weight of what he'd just done. He knew he'd made the right choice. He knew that if he had turned his back and walked away, if he had let that scene unfold, he would never again be able to look himself in the mirror. But knowing that didn't make any of this easier. The restaurant gradually slipped back into its usual rhythm, as if nothing had happened. The low murmur of conversations, the clinking of forks against plates, the smell of sautéed garlic and hot butter filling the air, taunting him with everything he had just given up. A couple at the next table glanced his way, then quickly turned back. A waitress he recognized, Someone who'd been working there for a while hovered near his table as if she wanted to say something, then silently moved on. David leaned back, tilting his head toward the ceiling, forcing himself to breathe slowly. In his mind, Frank's voice still echoed. "You feel sorry for them, don't you?" His gut tightened. This wasn't the first time he'd heard words like that, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. Amber sat across from him, her eyes brimming. "Daddy, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have asked to go out and eat." David reached out and wrapped his hand around her tiny one. "No, baby, don't ever think that. I wanted to bring you here. I still want your birthday to be special." "But now we don't have any money." David forced a smile. "I'll figure something out. I always do." But deep inside, he had no idea how he was going to manage. No rent, no food, nothing left at all. He didn't want to go home yet. He wasn't ready to return to that dark apartment and pretend everything was fine. He wasn't ready to think about tomorrow morning, waking up with empty hands, not knowing what to feed his daughter, with no plan, no safety net. So he stayed, head bowed, silent, forcing himself to swallow the gnawing hunger clawing at his insides. About 15 minutes later, it happened. David reached for his phone and shifted in his seat, his elbow accidentally knocking a napkin off the table. He sighed and bent down to pick it up, and that was when he saw it. Something small, lying still in the shadows under the opposite bench. Black, the edges of the leather slightly worn, his brows furrowed. He bent lower, letting his fingers brush against the cool, smooth surface, then pulled it out. A wallet. David opened it, his heart pounding. Right behind the clear plastic sleeve was a small photograph, slightly faded with age. Elaine and Arthur, much younger than they were now, stood side by side, smiling in front of a small house with bright white shutters. It was them. The realization made him jolt. He shot to his feet, eyes scanning the restaurant for any sign of the couple. But they were gone. His heartbeat quickened, thudding against his ribs. He had to do something. Without thinking any further, he turned to Amber. "Baby, we have to go. I need to find them." Amber nodded instantly and hopped down from her chair. David gripped the wallet tightly, pushed his chair back, and almost rushed out the door. He looked left, then right. The sidewalk was crowded, people moving past in a blur under the yellowish glow of the streetlights. But there was no sign of the elderly couple. He cursed under his breath, squeezing the wallet even tighter. He had to do something, and before doubt could catch up with him, he spun on his heel and strode, almost ran, down the street, heading toward the police station 2 blocks away. The police station was colder than David expected. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a pale, washed-out glow that made everything feel even more frigid. The officer at the front desk, Officer Daniel Grady, his badge gleaming under the light, looked up when David approached. His gaze lingered on David for a moment, as if trying to categorize him, before he spoke. "What can I do for you, sir?" David drew in a short breath and placed the wallet on the counter. "I found this. It belongs to an elderly couple, Elaine and Arthur Prescott. They just left Heartland Grill. I didn't catch them in time to return it." Officer Grady looked at the wallet, then back at David. His expression was unreadable, tinted with suspicion. "You're sure you found it where you said you did?" The words slashed straight through David's pride. He swallowed, keeping his voice steady. "Yes, I saw them drop it. I was there." Officer Grady exhaled a short, doubtful huff, then opened the wallet and flipped through the contents. "We'll contact them if we're able to find their information. Your name? Phone number? In case they want to thank you." David hesitated for only a brief beat before giving his information. Officer Grady jotted down a few lines, then nodded. "All right, we'll take it from here." That was it. Just one sentence. David turned and walked out of the police station. The night air hit him hard, biting cold, as if reminding him of everything he had just given up. He shoved his hands into the pockets of his jacket. Amber quietly held his hand, looking up at him, waiting for reassurance he didn't know how to give. He told himself he had done the right thing, that the wallet would be returned to its owners, that he didn't need thanks or acknowledgement. But the emptiness weighing down his chest refused to fade. A sense of something lost, a vague unease he couldn't name. When the two of them returned to the apartment, the room felt darker and colder than he remembered. The light flickered when he flipped the switch, looking seconds away from burning out. The faint smell of old instant noodles hung in the air, mingling with the usual musty dampness. David collapsed onto the torn sofa, head falling into his hands. What had he done? $15? Gone? Next week's rent still hung over him, sharp and heavy like a blade suspended above his head. No job, no plan, no way out. Amber climbed onto the sofa and wrapped her little arms around him, whispering, "Daddy, you did a good thing." David hugged her tightly, making sure she couldn't see his reddened eyes. "Thank you, baby." When Amber finally drifted to sleep on the sofa, as she did every night, David remained seated, staring at the bare wall in front of him. On the shelf, the pink eviction notice seemed to sneer at him. In the fridge, almost nothing remained. And on the wall, Patricia's wedding photo smiled down at him gently, a reminder of the promise he had never stopped trying to keep. "Promise me, you'll teach her to be a good person." David whispered toward the photograph, his voice cracking. "Honey, did I do the right thing? I just gave away everything we had left. And now, I don't know how we're going to get by." No answer came, only the ticking of the old clock in the silent room. David lowered his head, covering his face with both hands, letting the tears fall in the darkness, soft, unbroken, carrying everything he couldn't put into words. Morning came too early. Weak sunlight slipped through the thin curtains, painting pale streaks across the small living room. David pushed himself upright from the sofa he'd dozed off on, though he hadn't truly slept. His eyes felt heavy, his mind exhausted. Amber was still asleep, curled beneath a thin blanket, looking so fragile that his chest tightened. David tiptoed into the kitchen and opened the fridge. A nearly empty carton of milk, half a loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter. That was all. He made himself a cup of black coffee, no sugar, no milk, then sat at the table. The glass jar on the counter lay completely empty, staring at him like it was mocking him. Not a single coin left. The pink notice sat right beside it, the words "Final Notice" cutting into him like a blade. 7 days left. David set his cup down and covered his face with both hands. A wave of despair washed over him. How could he have been so foolish as to give away the very last money he had? How could he have taken such a risk? Then Elaine's face came back to him. The humiliation, the fear in her eyes. He remembered the way Frank had stood over them, dripping contempt. He remembered Amber sitting right beside him, witnessing everything. He couldn't let his daughter believe that standing by and doing nothing was the right thing. David took a deep breath. All right, he would figure it out. He had to. At exactly 7 a.m., Amber woke up. David had thinned out the oatmeal so there would be enough for one breakfast. She didn't complain, just ate quietly, those big round eyes understanding more than any 7-year-old should. "Daddy, are you going to work today?" David forced a smile. "Daddy's going to look for work, baby. Daddy will find something." But the truth was far harder. A 10-month gap on a resume was not easy to explain away. After dropping Amber off at school, David walked home. He didn't have enough for a bus fare. 45 minutes on foot, cold wind scraping against his face, but he had no other choice. Back home, he sat at the kitchen table, opened his old chipped laptop, and began the familiar routine, searching, applying, hoping. Again, as he had done hundreds of times before, his phone rang, an unknown number. David's heart jolted. Could it be a job opportunity? He answered quickly. "Hello? Good morning. May I speak with Mr. David Brooks?" Yes, this is he, the woman's voice continued, clear, professional. Mr. Brooks, I'm calling from the Kansas City Police Department. We were able to reach the owners of the wallet you turned in yesterday. They would like to speak with you directly. David let out a quiet breath. Do they have a phone number I can call? Actually, they would like to meet you in person. They requested your address and said they want to thank you directly. Would you be comfortable with that? David froze for a beat. They want to come to my home? Yes, sir. He looked around the apartment, the peeling walls, the worn furniture, the hint of dampness in the corners, the near-empty fridge. He hesitated. But then he remembered the Prescotts' faces, the kindness, the gratitude as they handed him the napkin with their number. He swallowed his self-consciousness. That's fine, he said. I'm okay with that. After he hung up, David stood in the middle of the small apartment, looking around as if seeing it for the first time. The torn sofa, the battered kitchen table, the stained walls, the nearly empty refrigerator. They would see all of it. They would know exactly how poor he was. David exhaled slowly, but he had nothing left to hide. And maybe, after yesterday, after everything that had happened, there was no reason to hide anymore. The knocking came sharp and sudden, so loud and unexpected that David jerked upright. The spoon slipped from his fingers and clattered into the bowl of oatmeal, the metallic sound slicing through the quiet room. Amber froze mid-bite, wide eyes lifting toward her father as if bracing for something unknown. David frowned. 8:30 a.m. No one came at this hour. No one knew their address. A cold shiver crept down his spine as he stepped toward the door. "Who is it?" he called, voice low, cautious. A short silence. Then a familiar voice, gentle, steady, floated through the crack under the door. "David, dear, it's Elaine and Arthur." David's heart leapt, tightening, then pulling painfully. He looked down at his hands trembling slightly, drew in a long breath, and unlatched the lock. Standing in the hallway were the Prescotts. In daylight, they looked different, simple yet polished. Elaine in a navy cardigan and cream scarf. Arthur in a brown coat with a neat little tie. But it wasn't their clothes that stunned David. It was their expression. Warm, sincere, profoundly compassionate. "Oh, sweetheart," Elaine whispered, her eyes glistening. "I had a feeling we'd find you here." David blinked, startled. How did you get my address?" Arthur chuckled softly. "The police called. They said a young man returned our wallet. And we knew it had to be you." Amber peeked out from behind her father's leg. Elaine glanced down, her smile softening even further. "And this must be your little princess." David placed a protective hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Yes, this is Amber." Arthur's gaze drifted past them into the apartment. The cramped living room, the peeling walls, the humming old refrigerator, the bright pink final notice envelope on the table. His shoulders stiffened. Elaine exhaled, not in shock, but in empathy, as though she understood everything in a single moment. You gave us everything you had, didn't you?" David said nothing. His silence was answer enough. "David," Arthur said gently but firmly, "we need to talk to you." David quickly shook his head. "I didn't do it for money. I didn't expect anything back. I just—" "We know," Elaine said, placing a hand over her heart. "And that is exactly why we came." David hesitated only a second before he stepped aside and opened the door wider. "Please, come in." Elaine sat on the worn sofa, while Arthur stood by the window, looking out at the gray city. No one spoke at first. The silence was thick, fog-like. David stood near the kitchen table, hands trembling slightly. It felt as if the last layer he used to shield his poverty had been stripped away. There was nowhere left to hide. Elaine was the one who finally broke the stillness. "David, dear, we want to ask you something." He swallowed hard. "Yes?" Arthur faced him directly. "Why did you do it?" David blinked. "Do what?" "Why did you stand up for us?" Elaine asked softly, but with weight. "You didn't know us. You could have walked away." David stayed quiet for a long moment. Then he said the truth, something he had never said out loud. "I couldn't let that happen." "Why?" Elaine asked again, even gentler. David looked down at Amber, sitting obediently on the wobbly chair, her clear eyes following every word. "Because I don't want my daughter growing up thinking that standing by and watching is the right thing to do." Silence fell again, shivering this time. Elaine raised a hand to her mouth, eyes filling. Arthur turned away, steadying himself. When he faced David again, his voice was low, thick with emotion. "David, you didn't just help us last night. You reminded us that there are still good people in this world." David bowed his head, speaking barely above a whisper. "I just did what I thought was right." Arthur nodded. "And that is exactly why we're here." Elaine stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on David's shoulder. "David, dear, we're not just an elderly couple." Arthur opened the wallet David had returned and pulled out a business card. He handed it to David. David looked at it. Then his eyes widened. Arthur Prescott, CEO, Prescott Holdings and Investments. He looked up, stunned. Elaine spoke softly. "We're millionaires, David. We built our company from nothing. And now, we try to help the people who truly deserve it." David shook his head, even stepping back. No, I can't accept." "This isn't charity," Arthur said, voice firm. "This is an opportunity." Elaine nodded. "We see a good heart in you, a wonderful father, a man who refuses to give up even when life knocks him down." Tears spilled down David's cheeks, unstoppable. I've failed. I can't give my daughter a better life. I can't even pay next week's rent." Arthur shook his head. "But you still gave everything you had to help strangers. That is not failure, David. That is strength." Elaine squeezed his shoulder gently. "We want to help you. A new home, a stable job, a better future for Amber." David collapsed onto a chair, burying his head in his hands. Amber rushed over and wrapped her arms around him. "Daddy, don't cry." David only cried harder. Elaine knelt beside him. "You're not alone anymore, David. We're here." David lifted his head at last, eyes red, voice shaking. Why would you do this for me?" Arthur smiled, a warm, deep, knowing smile. "Because 40 years ago, we were you. Poor, desperate, and a stranger helped us. They changed our lives. Now it's our turn to do that for someone else." David couldn't speak. He just held Amber close, letting the tears fall and wash months of buried pain from his chest. Finally, he drew a breath, wiped his eyes, and looked at them. Two people offering him a chance he never dreamed he'd receive. Elaine smiled gently. "Sweetheart, all you have to say is one word." "Yes." David looked at Amber, her eyes bright with hope, as if seeing the future for the first time. He turned back, nodded firmly, voice breaking. "Yes, I accept." A month passed like a dream, or, more accurately, like the final step out of a nightmare that had lasted far too long. David stood in front of the small house on the outskirts of Kansas City. White painted walls, green shutters, a fresh lawn, and a white wooden fence lining the walkway. Not a mansion, not luxurious, but it was theirs. Every corner, every window, carrying a new breath of hope. Amber ran across the yard like a little bird released from a cage, her bright laughter ringing through the morning air. "Daddy! Daddy, look! I have a little garden to grow flowers." David knelt, arms wide open as she raced into his embrace. For the first time in years, He smiled without forcing it. Yes, baby. You can grow anything you want. Behind them, Elaine and Arthur stood side by side, their smiles soft, like two people watching a promise finally fulfilled. Do you like it? Elaine asked gently. David rose, his gaze drifting across the windows. He saw Amber's first real bed, a proper dining table, a refrigerator full of food, things that had once felt like luxuries but now existed right in front of him. I don't know how to thank you enough, David said, his voice rough with emotion. Arthur stepped forward, placing a steady hand on David's shoulder. You don't owe us anything. You already paid, by what you did that night, when no one else would step up. Elaine nodded, her eyes glistening softly in the mild sunlight. As for work, we've arranged a position for you in the logistics department at Prescott Holdings. Stable salary, health benefits, and flexible hours, so you can spend time with Amber. David froze. You really? Why would you do all this for me? Arthur answered with a slow, deep smile, one that seemed to carry a lifetime within it. 40 years ago, we were in your shoes, poor, desperate, and a stranger helped us. He didn't need to know who we were. He just knew we needed help. And he told us, one day, when you can, help someone else. Elaine squeezed her husband's hand, nodding gently. We've carried that promise our whole lives. And today, we pass it on to you. David looked down at the grass, where Amber was gathering tiny wildflowers, laughing as if she had never known the hardship of the months before. He thought of Patricia, of that last night by her hospital bed, of her whispered words, "Promise me, you'll teach her to be good." He had kept that promise, and now it felt as though life itself was answering that steadfastness. David drew a deep breath, lifting his face, his eyes brighter than before. I'll carry this promise. I'll raise Amber the way Patricia wanted. And one day, we'll help someone else, just like you helped us. Elaine couldn't hold back anymore. A tear slipped down her cheek. That's all we ever hoped for. Amber ran over and hugged her father's leg, and David stood in that small yard between the two people who had changed his life, knowing that from this moment on, they would never be alone again. And here, in the little white house with green shutters, a new journey had begun. One of kindness passed forward from one generation to the next. 6 months later, David walked into Heartland Grill and Diner, Amber's small hand held tightly in his. The restaurant was the same as ever. The familiar smell of food, the clinking of plates, the warmth rolling out from the kitchen as if nothing in the world had changed. But they had changed. David wore a neat suit, nothing expensive but clean and well-pressed. Amber wore a new pastel dress, her hair tied up in a tidy ponytail. The deep traces of worry that had once carved themselves into David's face had softened. Life no longer pressed on him the way it used to. As they sat down, David looked around the restaurant, and his eyes stopped at a small table near the window. A young man, maybe 25, sat alone. He stared at the menu, lips pressed tight as though calculating every cent. In his hand were a few coins, clearly not enough for a proper meal. A server approached him, her tone carrying a hint of suspicion. "Are you ready to order?" The young man swallowed hard. I'll just have a glass of water." David looked at Amber. Amber looked back, and in her eyes he saw something that made his heart soften. She understood. She had learned exactly what he had hoped to teach her. David stood up. He walked to the young man's table and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Let me treat you today." The young man looked up, eyes wide with disbelief. You don't have to." David smiled. "I know. But someone once did the same for me. And now, it's my turn." Tears slipped down the young man's cheeks. Thank you. Thank you so much." David returned to his table and sat beside Amber. She looked at him with warm, shining pride. "Daddy, I love you." David wrapped his arms around her. I love you too, princess. And one day, you'll help someone else. That's how we pass kindness on. Amber nodded, as if making a vow. I will, Daddy. The two of them sat there, enjoying their meal, not because they were hungry, but because they could. Through the window, Kansas City glowed under the midday sun, alive, sprawling, full of roads still waiting to open up ahead. David looked outside, thinking of Patricia. Thinking of the promise he whispered beside her hospital bed. Thinking of how a small, simple act of kindness, one that seemed insignificant, had the power to change an entire life. For the first time in many years, David Brooks felt something he had lost for far too long. Peace. Kindness is never wasted. It spreads, it touches other lives, and it returns to you when you need it most. If this story touched you, tell me what city you're watching from. Your comments make this channel feel a little less lonely. And if you believe kindness can change the world, even just a little, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next story. See you in the next healing journey. Thank you for being here.